Right, so today I'm talking about the Zim gold currency. There have been so many people talking about this currency, so many experts from across the world that are commenting on this currency that is gold backed. And the question that people are asking themselves is it going to stand the test of time, or is it going to fall to inflation like the Zim dollar did? Now, I'm always saying to people that you're never going to know whether this currency is going to be able to maintain itself, and you're never going to know how to defend the currency if you don't understand the reasons that made the Zim dollar fall in the first place. Now, for 23 years, we've been told that the Zim dollar fell because of printing money. People have gotten their professorships, they've written theses for their PhDs and master's degrees, and they've been able to get their degrees by saying that Zimbabwe printed money, and that's why there was inflation and hyperinflation and the worst inflation in the world. And one thing I want to tell you today is that is a lie. For 23 years, there's been a monumental lie told in economics about the reasons why the Zimbabwean currency fell, because it did not fall by printing money. Now, most of you are surprised that I'm going to say this, but let me show you the empirical evidence over here. Now, take a look at this. This is a chart that was created by the Dallas Fed. This is not created by me. And on the other side is one that was created by the World Bank. And these two graphs will illustrate to you the lie that printing money causes inflation, because if it did, then the Western countries that have been quantitative easing to the tune of $40 trillion ever since they crashed the banking system would have seen inflation happening in their countries. America prints more money than any other country in the world, and they don't see inflation because printing money is not what destroys currencies or causes inflation. Now, look at this. This green line here is money supply in Zimbabwe from 1994 to 2008, when we actually began to see the hyperinflation. And this green line here has remained under 10% all the way to 2008, when we see the hyperinflation. Now, on top there is a red graph or a red line. That red line is inflation. All right? Now, for you to see that the inflation did not rise hand in hand with money supply, you have to take note of the intervals. So we've got 10% jumps to 100%. From 100%, it jumps to 1,000%, 10,000%, 100,000, million, and we remember our inflation reached 1 billion%. So from 1994, we were printing at about 5% per annum. We get to about 1996, 1997, the Zimbabwean government decides that it wants to pay the war veterans for their contribution to the liberation of Zimbabwe, because it was about to cause a civil war. And so they decided to print money. So they increased the printing of money from, in fact, it actually went down a little bit to 4%, then they increased it to about 7%. They held that 7% all throughout the year until the end of the year going into 2008, and then went down again to about 5%. And within that period, we had what is called Black Friday. Black Friday is when white businesses decided, we're not going to have this nonsense. This government can't be compensating its liberation fighters, so we're going to take out our money. So they took out about $3.5 billion from the economy. What is interesting is they took out their money because the government of Zimbabwe had printed an equivalent of $200 million US in local currency. They did not give our war veterans US dollars, but they printed in local currency. But these same people had no problem with the government of Zimbabwe compensating the Rhodesian soldiers to the tune of $750 million US that was paid in foreign currency from 1980 up to this point. But they had a problem with the government of Zimbabwe printing local currency, giving it to its war veterans who were going to use it in the economy, create businesses, build houses, and quantitative ease to actually benefit the economy. So the divestment that happened here caused this inflation that you see over there. So for 3 years, we saw the inflation rising from 15% to 80%, where it peaked out in 1999. That's about 99 November. In 99 November, something monumental happened. The International Development Association and the IMF decided that they were no longer going to give Zimbabwe pre-approved loans for infrastructure development, telecommunications, hospitals, transport, malaria, and other things. These were pre-approved loans that the Zimbabwean government was denied. But what is interesting is the Zimbabwean government had not defaulted on any of its payments. So why were they being denied their loans by the IMF? There was an intention by the West to sabotage the Zimbabwean government so that it cannot do its projects that it wanted to do, so that MDC could be assisted to win elections in 2000 March. So that was the reason they did it. However, you will begin to see that once we get to this point, the inflation actually came down a little bit to about 70%, and it held all the way through until mid 2001. But in mid 2001, this is where the deprivation of multilateral lending loans was now concretized in 𝗖𝗔𝗟𝗟. And so you see 𝗖𝗔𝗟𝗟 coming in about there, inflation starts to rise again. And it rises, gets to about 2003, April, March, we see more sanctions imposed by the US government after they failed to remove Robert Mugabe through 𝗖𝗔𝗟𝗟. And so you see inflation rising again, and rises all the way to about 2005. Then all of a sudden, it starts to fall. And what happened in 2005, we had the introduction of the second executive order sanctions. But by then, Zimbabweans were beginning to understand how to handle these sanctions. So these executive orders that were imposed on individuals, 80 of them, plus the 80 that were put under the first executive order sanctions in 2003, Zimbabwe felt that they were now able to handle this country with the 𝗖𝗔𝗟𝗟, the first executive order sanctions, second executive order sanctions. You start seeing the falling of inflation. And as it fell, then about end of 2005, the sanctions start pinching, and all of a sudden we see a rise again in inflation. And it continues to rise all the way to when we get to 2008. We have our elections, they're disputed, and then all of a sudden the Americans put the third set of sanctions that were now targeted on the government of Zimbabwe, its parastatals, banks, private businesses, and in fact, the entire nation. And all of a sudden, we see a shoot up of inflation all the way to 1 billion% in this same year of 2008. But what was happening with the money supply? Nothing. It stayed under 10% all the way to 2008. So no printing of money happened to justify that inflation that hit over 100 million%, 100,000%, and 1,000,000% and 1 billion%. It was not money supply that caused that. We know this because we also know that in economics, when your inflation outstrips or is higher than the rate at which you're printing money, you actually have a contraction of money supply. So Zimbabwe did not have a problem of printing money during this period. They had a contraction of money supply. And so the notion that we printed money is actually lies. We actually contracted. But what caused this inflation then? What caused inflation to run from 70% here all the way to over 1,000,000% in a period of 5 years? It is because of the divestment of multinationals, businesses, white farmers leaving the country, externalization of their savings, and also externalization even by black Zimbabweans. A lot of money left the country, a lot of foreign currency left the country, and even the banks were corrupt and were assisting those who were externalizing to externalize illegally. We also had a crash of industry, a crash of farming, and that crash of industry and farming meant we were consuming much more than we're producing, so we're importing. So we're using the little foreign currency that we had to import. Why are you quiet, babe, man? I'm fixing this stuff.
Okay.
Oh. Stop. This is going to be the hardest.